fund subsidies, and it defines what a subsidy is, what the operating costs, what the revenues are. If possible, if the legislature could take cognizance of this definition or clarify the definition in legislation in order to avoid a future argument, I think it would be a good idea. Finally, if you could somehow communicate to the U.S. Department of Transportation and to the Congress the importance and the independence of Caltrain electrification, that would be good. The attacks on Caltrain electrification create uncertainty for high-speed rail, but they create a near-death event for Caltrain. And yet there's very little connection between those two projects, except that ultimately a good investment will turn out to be an even better investment. And getting this point across, I think, would make a lot of difference. So this covers what I'd like to discuss. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
We're going to have some questions. I'm going to raise the one that I'm immediately concerned about right now. And what is the current status of the Caltrain funding with the federal government? And what do we need to do to make sure that project is built on schedule and on budget? And are we having slippage on that project? Because every time the project is delayed, it costs money. So I'm speaking as an original board member of Caltrain. We were one of the founders of Caltrain. I was on the board. I chaired the right-of-way committee that purchased the right-of-way of Caltrain. We packaged the proposition funds and the local funds to buy the right-of-way, finish the construction of the infrastructure, buy the trains, continue the master planning and building project. We made the investments. We passed our local bond election last year, funding a half-cent sales tax with the federal commitment that they would pay for their share. We're paying for a greater share in the local government funding than the federal government's paying. Now, all of a sudden, we get the rug pulled out from under us, and we're looking at higher costs. So I want to know what the current status is, because my county's taxpayers have put their necks out in Santa Clara County, as well as San Mateo in San Francisco County. We're worried about the loss of our tens of millions of dollars of local half-cent sales tax.
Mr. Chairman, I'll start. Mr. Morales and I have both been involved in extensive discussions on this. In fact, as early as about 2 hours ago, or recently as 2 hours ago. Let me just say at the outset, this was an unjustified and really outrageous action to hold back on federal money for Caltrain. And it was stimulated by a letter from some 14 members of the California delegation in the majority side, based on a false premise that somehow high-speed rail, if they have issues with high-speed rail, I acknowledge that, that's fine, but that somehow stopping a grant that came from an entirely different part of the Department of Transportation. We're funded through the Federal Railroad Administration. Caltrain's grant of $647 million was for capacity expansion, having nothing to do with high-speed rail, and it's funded by the Federal Transit Administration. And that grant is
working on it for 15 years.
Working on it for 15 years. When the High-Speed Rail Authority, under our combined leadership and with the recommendation of the peer review group as well as Peninsula congressional, senatorial, and assembly members, urged high-speed rail to look at abandoning a separate set of tracks up the peninsula and sharing track with Caltrain, the so-called blended approach. We committed $600 million of Prop 1A bond money, and an additional $113 million of allocated cap and trade money to that project. And so that is the high-speed rail connection. It helps them reduce their costs, us reduce our costs. But as you said, and as Mr. Thompson said, their project operates for the purpose of electrifying a highly valuable, highly utilized service in the peninsula that's essential for Silicon Valley. And so I think so I first want to say it is absolutely, there is no policy justification for the federal government withholding that money. The second thing I want to say is that as we speak today, the leadership from Caltrain and the MTC are in Washington, and they're making the argument to anybody who will listen to it. I think that there are two things that are very important here, and Mr. Chairman, one of them is going to be troubling. The new president is about to issue his first budgetary expression this Thursday. It is possible that beyond this particular action, which, as I said, was unjustified, we need to see if the administration is going to support the overall program in that area. And that could be a threat regardless. Secondly, I know, although high-speed rail is not the lead, and in fact, I think somebody aimed at us and shot the hostage, quite frankly. We're not the lead on this, but we're aware of what's happening. Secretary Kelly is deeply engaged in this as well. As you know, Governor Brown wrote a letter directly to Secretary Chow on the Caltrain issue, asking if he could discuss this with her in person. So the governor is behind it. There's bipartisan support for it. I actually think it was kind of a mistake on the part of the authors of the letter. I think they were assuming that the Caltrain grant was somehow part of our program. It's not. So I think the status of it is twofold.
I read the letter.
Yeah.
Didn't bear any relationship to reality.
I would agree with that. And so what we're hoping is that, look, there may be legitimate concerns that the authors of the letter had with wanting to make sure that federal dollars are not flowing through us to Caltrain. We can satisfy those concerns if we have the opportunity to. And so I think what we'd like to do is be part of the solution to help engage with those members to kind of answer any legitimate issues they have, but to really try to move this program forward quickly. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, the Caltrain has already suffered $20 million in excess cost by holding their contracts open till...
That's just the minor top of it. It's going to be much more.
Right.
It's going to cost us a lot of money by the time this hot air finishes.
Well, I wish I had a better answer for you, except to say this is something that the governor's focused on, the Secretary of Transportation's focused on, the Bay Area leadership is focused on. We're all trying to engage with people in Washington to resolve this as quickly as possible. But it's not about high-speed rail. And they're kind of the innocent bystanders.
Okay, I just wanted to ask that because, I don't know, I guess I'm a little upset about it. You can tell, right? But I think it's very unfair when we go to the voters in all three counties and place something on the ballot after the federal government made commitments, a full funding grant agreement. That's what it was, right? And we made these commitments based on their signed letter agreeing to fund it, and then all of a sudden they hold it back. And I think, you know, it'll send ripples through the transportation finance for all other projects in the country if we can't honor full funding grant agreements in terms of financing transportation. I think it has a bigger impact on the bonding and financing of transportation dependent on federal grants, if that's the kind of thing that happens a lot. And I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well,
you know how to finance, you know how you finance projects with the federal funds, with the full funding grant agreements, and it's a commitment from the federal government to finance things, and then after they make that commitment, you go out and you sell a bond to construct the project per the schedule, and then have having the rug pulled out from under you, it's going to make the bonds worthless or very expensive at the least, I would think.
And
More interest is a higher risk. You're going to have a higher risk. You're going to have a riskier proposition if the federal government's going to be doing these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were in Washington last week as well, talking to DOT and members of the delegation and others, but I was also at the opening of the American Public Transit Association meetings, and I can, on your point there, I can tell you this has sent shockwaves throughout all transit operators, because as was the case here, you spend years developing a plan, going through the process, and in this case, having it actually signed off on by the DOT. All that needed was a signature at this point, and there was a mandatory waiting period to get the signature, but the review was completed. They had passed all the hurdles, satisfied all the requirements of the law, and there's a grave concern among communities around the country about what this could signal if this stands, what it could mean in terms of pulling, as you said, pulling the rug out from under projects all over the country.
Well, thank you for giving me any kind of clarification. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks on the...
One other important point on this is that it's important to note that, and Mr. Thompson alluded to this, he called this the D plan, just for members of the committee. Under the Bond Act, under 17 whatever, subsection D, after the legislative appropriation, before we get access to the bonds, we have to go through certain steps. The last of those steps was to go to the Director of Finance, show that there was financial sufficiency. We took 2 D plans to the Director of Finance, one for the Central Valley, which he was able to sign off on. And I was happy to hear that Mr. Thompson agreed with the assessment that there's financial sufficiency for that. The other was for our share of the bond money contribution to the Caltrain corridor, which he could not sign off on because of this federal, but he did indicate that he is prepared to move forward expeditiously. So I would say, members of this body, raising your voice to your counterparts in our congressional delegation, I think would be important. We're ready to go.
Well, both the Assembly and Senate chairs of the Transportation Committee have sent a letter to our congressional delegation and the administration in Washington asking that the final agreement be concluded, and so we can put the project out to bid and cause no more delay. This project, you know, we're going to be losing tens of millions of dollars every month this project is delayed. This is a $10 million a month delay cost that's going to be absorbed, probably all but the local. I don't know the federal government ever absorbs any cost increases. Do you? It's always the local local funding that absorbs the delay cost, and that's kind of, I think, the real rub with the locals in my community. That money will not be able to be spent on other projects due to this action of the federal government in delaying this project. So we will not have money for other projects and other things we want to do.
And as you know, Mr. Chairman, we're a tax donor state, and in this case, the local money that you raised, along with our money and the federal money, was going to fund the production of rail cars in Utah and Florida and across the United States. So lots of people get hurt.
I think Senator Skinner had a question. And others?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this, and thank you, Dan, Mr. Morales, and Mr. Thompson for joining us. Mr. Richard, you brought up the issue of potentially being able to, and I'm not sure exactly how you worded it, but if our high-speed rail project is successful and we have, and there's economic development as a result near the stations, that we might be able to benefit from that in terms of the long-term funding viability, economic viability of high-speed rail. I raise it because, as you know from being on the BART board, BART had the opportunity potentially to have established something like, I think they're called like financing districts around BART stations, so that BART might have benefited from a portion of the value of the property as it went up partly due, of course, to the result of BART's presence. And that wasn't established. And so now, if we were to establish it, we have to go back and get the commercial property owners' permission. And of course, usually that might happen, but most people don't like to voluntarily sign up to lose some money. So is it already anticipated that you would structure it from the start to accomplish this?
That's related to also their infrastructure financing districts.
That's right.
Around transit stations. We had our legislation on that a few years ago.
Well, even though I'm a member of the Brown administration, I could also point out, Senator, that BART was a 50% owner of a redevelopment authority around the Pleasant Hill BART station and was able to harvest the development around that. But I was talking with the chairman before the hearing began. There's a broader question here, and that is making sure that the public investment in this massive project reap the benefits of what this could mean in the urban areas that we serve. And from the very beginning, I expressed to the governor that I thought that if we did not focus on the transit land use interaction, that we were missing an enormous opportunity. I created a transit land use committee of the High-Speed Rail Authority. I named myself as chair after we lost an excellent former member, Catherine Perez-Estelano, whom you may know, because there are two things about this that I think are important. One is sustainability, making sure that we have the right kind of density and connectivity around the stations. And then the second is